Howdy, I'm Vaughn Bryant, and this is Anthropology 205. Today, this is the last lecture. We're going to be trying to wrap up things about the Middle East and try to help you understand the big problems that exist there and why we have been so engaged in the Middle East for so many years. So let's turn to the first slide, and remember last time we were talking about Operation Eagle Claw. Now, if you recall, what we said last time was that the Ayatollah Khomeini had taken over the American embassy. They were holding over 400 hostages in the American embassy for more than a year. And finally, the military came to President Carter and said, well, why don't we launch a special, let's say, special ops operation, go into Iran and sneak in and get our captives. Now, of course, a lot of this was based on the very successful raid that the Israelis did in the return of the 109 hostages from the airplane in Entebbe, Uganda. We've already mentioned this. So anyway, President Carter says, okay, let's go ahead and do that. So unfortunately, though, things did not go well. And Operation Eagle Claw was really a terrible disaster. The first attempt was in April of 1980, and the helicopters flew from the aircraft carrier SS Nimitz into the eastern part of Iran, where they then landed, but they ran into a big dust storm which crippled 2 of the helicopters. The other 6 helicopters that were supposed to show up the next morning came in, but some of them got crippled because of the sandstorm as well. And then finally, they decided to abort the whole operation because they didn't have enough helicopters to take the hostages back. And so on the return trip, one of the helicopters ran into the Hercules C-130, and it crashed. And so it was a terrible disaster. A few months later, the military came back to Carter and said, let's try it again. Unfortunately, the second operation also failed, much for the same reasons. Ran into dust storms, helicopters crashed, and so forth. The interesting thing is that there was a rumor that the Israelis had come to President Carter and basically said, hey, we'll go get your hostages for you. We'll do it like we did on the raid in Entebbe. But on the other hand, Carter said, well, could you guarantee that you would save everybody? And they said, well, we'd do our best, but there's always a possibility that some of the hostages could get killed. So Carter didn't want to do that. But anyway, so Operation Eagle Claw was basically a total disaster. Well, let's take a look now exactly what happened. We helped Iraq. Remember, we were giving money to Saddam Hussein. We helped Iraq try to overthrow the Iranian government in 1979 when Iraq declared war on Iran. And that was really the primary reason why the Ayatollah got so angry at the United States and captured the U.S. Embassy. There's a recent film made a couple of years ago called Argo, which is about that particular event, about the seizure of the American Embassy. And it's really worth renting if you have time, or if you have Netflix, you might want to take a look at it. Between 1979 and 2016, this year, the United States and the UN had imposed economic sanctions on Iran because we were afraid that they were trying to make a nuclear bomb. Now, whose reactors were they using? Guess what? They were using our reactors. Remember during the Eisenhower's Atom for Peace? We gave them more than a dozen reactors. For 20 years, we supplied them with information on nuclear energy, on how to make nuclear energy, or how to keep the reactors going. We sent people to Iran to help them. They sent people over here to learn how to use reactors and learn all about nuclear energy. So quite honestly, their whole nuclear emphasis was a result of the spark that we had given them way back during the Eisenhower administration. So basically, their nuclear capacity was our fault. Well, some other things happened. In 1980, now remember, in 1979, they have seized the American embassy. In 1979, Iraq has invaded Iran. And in 1980, intelligence sources reported that the French were helping the Iraqis build a nuclear plant right outside of Baghdad. Now, Iran panicked because Iran was fighting a war with Iraq, and they were afraid that if Iraq learned how to make a nuclear bomb, the first people they would try it out on would be the Iranians. So Iran decided that they were going to take care of that reactor by bombing it. So the Iranian Air Force then sent a squadron of planes from Tehran all the way up to Baghdad to, in fact, bomb the facility. Unfortunately, the Iranians were not a very good, I don't know, you want to call it very good Air Force or whatever. They did bomb the facility, but they only did minimal damage, and they did not put it out of operation. In fact, within a few days, it was back in operation. That particular operation became known as Operation Scorched Sword. So Operation Scorched Sword was the Iranians' attempt to destroy the nuclear reactor with airplanes sent from Tehran. Now, Israel also was very much afraid of Iraq making a nuclear reactor because they knew that the Muslims, particularly Iraq and Iran, everybody was basically saying that they wanted to get rid of the Jews in Israel. So Israel then was afraid that if Iraq did get a nuclear bomb, maybe they might use it on Iran, but they also were afraid they were going to use it on Israel. So the Israelis decide that the only way to prevent this is that they are going to go destroy the reactor where the Iranians had failed. This became known as Operation Opera, and it took place in the early part of 1981. You can see the map up here on how the planes actually left. They left here from Israel. They then came down through Saudi Arabia and over to Baghdad. You can read an account about this, and it's really quite interesting because the Israeli planes were talking Arabic and they had Jordanian accents. And so when they were challenged by Air Force planes in Saudi Arabia, they told them that they were just Jordanian airplanes that were off course, because of course here's Jordan. And the Saudi Arabians believed it. So they managed to sneak all the way into Iraq, pretending to be part of the Jordanian Air Force. So this was Operation Opera, and it was very successful. Now Israel then, of course, gets they became the bad guys because here they had made a preemptive strike on the Iraqis. Now, the Israelis said that all they were doing was enforcing what became known as the Begin Doctrine. The Begin Doctrine in Israel basically states that Israel will always strike a nuclear capacity in any state in the Middle East that they consider to be a threat to the safety of Israel. So, in other words, anybody in the Middle East who basically has said death to Israel and then has a nuclear reactor, the Israelis are going to take it out. They're going to go bomb it. The 1981 attack on Iraq was very strongly criticized around the world, including by the United States. Israel was criticized in the United Nations. They were criticized by the General Assembly for their actions of the preemptive strike on the nuclear plant in Iraq. Now, the French, who had been helping the Iraqis with their nuclear plant, basically argued that this was nonsense, that the nuclear plant they were helping Iraq make was intended only for peaceful use. And in fact, the French pointed out that the reactors that they were helping the Iraqis install and build could not be used to make, let's just say plutonium at a grade that could be used in a bomb. It was basically a nuclear reactor that was designed to make electricity. So the French basically said there was no reason to bomb it because it could not have been used to make bombs. But nevertheless, the Israelis did bomb it, and they did destroy it. And as I said, they used what they call the Begin Doctrine as their justification for doing this. From 1980 to 2016, Iran has worked on building a nuclear presence. Now, where did they get all of this information? Where did they get the nuclear reactors? Where did they learn all about this? Again, I keep saying over and over again, they learned all of this from the United States, back at a time when we were fairly peaceful with Iran. And it was all part of the Atoms for Peace, when the United States was trying to pacify, actually trying to basically run the Middle East, and they were hoping that by Atoms for Peace that we could convert Iran into a democratic government and a pro-Western government. The United States, of course, also had a vested interest in Iran because we had a Shah. As long as the Shah was in power in Iran up until 1979, then the United States was guaranteed that we could use the oil fields to our benefit and that we could ensure the fact that Iran would be friendly towards the United States and the West. And that's why we were able to help the Shah build his nuclear facilities. So anyway, after the Shah was deposed, after the coup in 1979, by 1980, under the new administration of the ultra-conservative Ayatollah Khomeini, Iran then goes back into a mode of trying to rebuild and finish the nuclear reactors. The United States and the UN Security Council threatened to impose economic sanctions against Iran if they continued to work on their nuclear presence, which of course they did. So the United States and the Security Council then did, in fact, freeze most of their assets in banks and other places overseas. Now, this particular economic sanctions did, in fact, cause a lot of problems for the Iranians. It made it very difficult for them to buy supplies. They couldn't buy parts for their military weapons. They couldn't get certain kinds of food. They couldn't sell their oil. There were a lot of things that were really very bad, and it made life in Iran really pretty miserable. The Israelis also had threatened to bomb the Iran facility if Iran didn't stop building the nuclear presence. So we've got the Israelis on the razor's edge, ready to bomb the facilities. We've got the United States and the UN trying to get Iran to stop working on their nuclear reactors so that we could lift economic sanctions and make it easier for the people living in Iran. You can see the map here. These are all of the places that Iran had nuclear plants that they were building here. And of course, Iran was saying the same thing that Iraq had said. We're building nuclear facilities only for economic and electrical purposes, domestic purposes, and not for warfare. Finally, in 1913, the Iranian centralist candidate, Hassan Rouhani, won the Islamic Republic's presidential election. Now remember, they've been having presidential elections in Iran ever since the Shah was deposed in 1979. So we can definitely say that, at least from the standpoint of elected officials, Iran does comply with that. So anyway, Rouhani then had won the presidential election in 2013, and one of the things that he had pledged was to improve the economy to help prevent the high amount of unemployment, and to basically try to end the sanctions, the economic sanctions on the country. Now, Rouhani actually had been a former nuclear negotiator for the country of Iran when they were working with the UN and the United States and trying to come up with some kind of amiable conclusion. Anyway, so he said that he would address the high tensions between the UN and U.S. and Iran, and would try to then raise, he would try to erase then the economic sanctions. Well, actually, it was very successful, and after that was 2013. It took 3 years of negotiating, but finally, in January of this year, 2016, in Vienna, Austria, the Big Five plus one, who consists basically of the U.S., the U.K., France, China, Russia, and Germany. That's the 5+1. So the 5+1 then, working with the negotiators from Iran, finally were able to strike a deal that met everybody's concern. And so this was championed as a real advantage. It was going to have peace finally, and we didn't have to worry about Iran anymore. Now, of course, not everybody was happy with this. There were many people in the United States who argued that, well, we don't believe that Iran is really going to keep their part of the bargain, that they're going to really be making a bomb, and that we, in essence, then have given them a green light by erasing the economic sanctions. And so it was really quite a challenge to get this approved through the Congress and to ensure that the United States then would sign off on this agreement. But anyway, we did, as well as the other 5+1. So exactly what did we agree to? What is it that supposedly is supposed to bring peace to the area and prevent another war? Well, let's take a look at some of the points. First of all, the agreement says that Iran's uranium stockpile will be reduced by 98% down to only 300 kilograms in 15 years. So in other words, they're going to reduce the available uranium stockpile that they currently have by 98%, and by the end of 15 years, it will be down to only 300 kilograms of nuclear material. Iran has had almost 20,000 centrifuges in 2015. Now, what are the centrifuges? Why are they important? Because these very high-grade centrifuges are what are necessary to spin out the plutonium from the nuclear material in order to make the kinds of uranium that you would need, or the plutonium that you would need to make a bomb. So with these 20,000 centrifuges then, they could have in fact perhaps made a bomb. So part of the deal with this new agreement then, which was called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, Iran agreed to, in essence, destroy most of these centrifuges, and Iran is now limited to using no more than 5,060 of the older and the much less effective centrifuges during the next 10 years. Now, with these older and less effective centrifuges, yes, they can make nuclear material that can be used for powering electrical plants, but they do not have the ability to make, let's say, bomb-grade uranium. So basically, if they in fact do follow the agreement, they cannot make nuclear weapons. And this is why the 5+1 nations believe that this was a good deal. Now, what did Iran get in exchange for this? What did they get for agreeing to do this? Well, first of all, the agreement provided relief from these international economic sanctions. And so the first thing was that in exchange for limiting their nuclear capacity, Iran then has these economic sanctions lifted, which had been in place for nearly 20 years. The Iran deal provided the Islamic Republic, is what Iran is called, with an estimated $140 billion in accounts that had been frozen for many, many years. Now, these were accounts that were in many different countries, which were owed to Iran because of the sale of oil, for one thing. And finally, Iran now has access to that money, so they can now use it. So $140 billion in the deal is released so that they can now use it. Iran currently spends about 65% of its defense budget to fund what they call the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or the IRGC. Now, this is a paramilitary force that uses the funding given to them by the government to support Iran's interest in other regions of the Middle East. So basically, this is sort of like a granting agency that gives money to other places in the Middle East that Iran feels that will be an asset to them. So it's very possible that with the release of this $140 billion of aid, that more of the money is going to go to the IRGC. Why is this an important issue? Because the IRGC actively supports Shia terrorists all over the Middle East. Iran is one of the primary supporters of terrorist groups all over the Middle East, particularly those groups which are ultra-conservative and believe in the literal translation of the Quran. So the IRGC currently funds the Houthis in Yemen, which is basically an offshoot of Al-Qaeda and the ISIS groups. The Hezbollah in Lebanon, we've already talked about the Hezbollah in Lebanon. Basically, they are very ultra-conservative ones that are fighting against the government in Lebanon. And of course, the Hamas, who are in control of Gaza. Hamas are the groups that are currently in charge of Gaza. They are the ones that are continually harassing Israel with rockets and other things. But most of the support also goes to assist Syria. So the president Assad in Syria basically can count on a significant amount of money coming from the IRGC to help him stay in power. And this is, of course, a very sore point with the Western powers who've been trying to get rid of him, who have been trying to end the war that has been going on in Lebanon now for a number of years. Iran today is basically a slightly different place than it was before. The United States and the Western powers believe that with this new nuclear deal that the situation in Iran is going to improve. And they're hoping that Iran will in fact allow the continued inspections of their nuclear plants to confirm that they are following the dictates of the agreement. The deal that has occurred in Iran happened only because the new prime minister is a moderate. Now, Ayatollah Khomeini was an ultra-conservative Shia member, and currently we have someone who's a little bit more modern, and more moderate. And he basically won the election because in Iran there are getting to be a few more reformers, there are getting to be a few more people in Iran who are not quite as ultra-conservative as they had been in the past. And so Hassan Rouhani then wants Iran to continue with its nuclear program. He's promised that it's only going to be used for peaceful purposes. Now, in spite of all of this, in spite of the agreement, Israel, of course, under their Begin doctrine, and the current prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, basically has said as far as Israel is concerned, nothing has changed. They basically don't buy that the agreement that has been signed will actually prevent Iran from making a bomb. So the Israelis have basically said, look, we're going to do whatever's needed. We're going to enforce the Begin doctrine. And if we believe that we need to go bomb them, then by golly, we'll go do that. So anyway, that's what the situation is as of right now in 2016. Now let's turn our attention to Afghanistan. Afghanistan is America's longest war. We have been fighting in Afghanistan since 2001. This is 2016. That's 15 years we've been in Afghanistan. And Afghanistan is still a very hot place where the United States has to continue support and send troops. In the picture here at the very bottom left over here, these are basically ISIS groups, and ISIS, of course, are one of the groups that we're currently fighting in Afghanistan. Let's take a quick look at the Afghan history then and see how we got into this mess. First of all, Afghanistan is a very large mountainous country. It has no seaports, has very few rivers. Water is a very hard to find commodity. It's much like many of the other places in the Middle East, very dry. The only place in Afghanistan where you can really grow many crops is up here in the northern part, right along here, which is not quite as mountainous and in fact has some fresh water. The northern part of Afghanistan does in fact right up in here have oil and gas reserves that can be used, but the big problem is that because of the wars and everything, it's very, very difficult to drill for oil. The other thing is that the mountains in Afghanistan, people have been in there, geologists have been in there, and they said that the mountains in Afghanistan do in fact have gold deposits, they have silver deposits. There are some areas where there are emeralds, there are other areas that have precious gems, there are even some areas that have diamonds. So why aren't people exploiting these natural resources in Afghanistan? Mainly because of the war. You can't go in and try mining when people are going to be killed. Over 80% of the world's supply of opium and heroin now comes from Afghanistan. And for a long time, a lot of that opium and heroin used to make it to the United States, but no longer. Today, the opium and heroin that comes from Afghanistan is almost all sold in Europe and areas of Asia. So where is the heroin in the United States coming from? Primarily from new sources in Mexico and also new sources in Colombia. Both the Mexicans and the Colombians are now growing poppies, and they're making something called black tar heroin. So all of the heroin in the United States now is coming from Mexico and Colombia, no longer coming from Afghanistan. But nevertheless, Afghanistan still produces about 80% of all the opium and heroin in the world today. Here's a map showing Afghanistan, and I think you can see this area right here in the center is all the mountainous area. It is very high elevation and very little water, very difficult terrain to drive in, walk in, and so forth. Right up here is the only area that really is arable. This is where most of the poppies grow, up here in this area. And of course, this area up in here is also where the proven oil and gas reserves are. Here is Pakistan over here. And this is, of course, one of the main staging areas that Al-Qaeda and ISIS are using to attack places in Afghanistan and so forth. And then India, of course, is over here. Afghanistan, as I said earlier, is located at the crossroads of Asia. It was one of the earliest regions that had farming, it had cities, it had city-states. The region was conquered many times by people coming out of the Middle East. And, everybody, the Persians, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, the Assyrians. And so Afghanistan had been conquered a number of different times. The region was finally conquered by another group coming out of Asia. In 1219, the Mongols under Genghis Khan swept down out of Asia and managed to conquer Afghanistan. And they remained in power in Afghanistan. Successive Mongol kings remained in control until 1709, when the local Afghans were finally able, in a coup, to kill the Mongol rulers and then set up their own government. After the coup in 1709, King Aman Shah conquered the rest of Afghanistan and part of Pakistan, much of northern India, and even some areas of eastern Iran, consolidated all of this under his rule as one big country. The last king of Afghanistan lost control of the area to the British in a war that occurred in the mid-1800s. Now, the Great Britain should have learned their lesson about Afghanistan. When we invaded Afghanistan in 2001, of course, the United States had the help of Great Britain, and they went back to Afghanistan just like we did. But the British had been in Afghanistan before. They should have known. They should have realized that what problems exist in Afghanistan. The first British invasion and war in Afghanistan actually began in 1839. Essentially, it was a war to protect India. Remember, the British had taken over India. It was one of their primary colonies. And the area that is Pakistan today, at one time, of course, was part of India. So India was a big British colony, and the British did not like the fact that pirates and terrorists coming out of Afghan were raiding areas of northern India and what is now Pakistan. So in order to do away with these pirates and thieves and so forth, the British decided that they were going to go in and put down the unrest in Afghanistan. So the British then take a group of soldiers, they go into Afghanistan, and they capture the region, and then they try to govern it. Well, continued terrorist actions and poor British military leadership, and of course the very difficult terrain in the country and so forth, made it extremely difficult to control. Afghanistan consists of many, many different tribal leaders and tribes, and each one wants to do their own thing. It's very difficult to consolidate everybody and get all of the sled dogs to drive in the right direction. So nevertheless, the British had a real difficult time trying to control the area. So from 1839 until 1842, the British remained in Afghanistan. Finally, in January of 1842, the continued terrorist activities, the continued problems of trying to govern a place, finally created such a problem that the British Foreign Office told the British to just leave Afghanistan, that we just don't worry about it anymore. So the British troops then decided to leave Afghanistan in January of 1842. 16,000 British troops left Kabul and headed through the Khyber Pass back to India. Now, unfortunately for the British, this turned out to be one of the greatest British military disasters in history. The Afghan rebels continued to harass the British as they were retreating. The Afghan rebels destroyed much of their food. They destroyed many of the wagons. The continued guerrilla action made it very difficult for the British to continue their attempt to leave the country. And then finally, because it was January and because the Khyber Pass is very, very high elevation, and the British were not dressed warmly enough, many of the British soldiers actually froze to death. So from all of these different activities, the vast majority of the British who retreated from Afghanistan died. In fact, the military records that less than a dozen troops, less than a dozen out of 16,000 actually survived and made it back to India. So that was a terrible disaster on the part of the British, and it represented a case of just poor planning, poor leadership, and an ineffective way of trying to run the country. The British, however, are not going to give up. Continued harassment from Afghans into their areas of northern India forced the British to go back to Afghanistan in 1878. So the Second Anglo-Afghan War then begins in 1878. Only this time the British take in 40,000 troops instead of 16,000 in order to occupy the country. They set up a local tribal chief as the new king of Afghanistan in charge of the region. It became known as King Abdur Rahman. Now the British were finally able to remove some of those 40,000 troops, but they found that they had to keep at least 25,000 British troops in Afghanistan in order to ensure that the king could remain in power. Why did they want the king in power? Because they had put him there. He was a puppet, and he would do whatever the British wanted. So the King Abdur Rahman, who was known as the Iron Emir, consolidated the region with British help, and with the British backing then, he ruled the region from 1880 until 1901. The king was really, as I said a minute ago, a British puppet. He was ruthless. He killed thousands of Afghans that opposed him, and of course the British helped him do this. But on the other hand, he was able to unify the region and more or less consolidate it under one rule. The next king was King Amanullah Khan, who ascended to the throne in 1919. Now remember, 1919 is right after the end of World War I. The new king declared war on the British. The British were still in Afghanistan. They had been there throughout the time to help the Iron Emir. But in 1920 then, the new king who had taken over tells the British to get out. So the British then are forced to leave. The king then gained complete control of the area, and he now declares that this whole new area is going to be considered the new country of Afghanistan. So now we have the new country of Afghanistan. It's now ruled by somebody who does not like the British and somebody who, in fact, has thrown out the British. In 1973, Mohammed Dur Khan, you see his picture here on the stamp here, was able to seize control in a coup. And he declared that the region would now be called the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan. And he declared himself to be the president of this new nation. Now, part of the deal was that he said that since it was in fact a democratic republic, that he was going to hold elections for members of parliament, which in fact he did. And so the people then were elected to parliament. In 1978, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, known as the PDPA, then assassinated the Khan in a coup, and they take over the country. So essentially what we have is, after the British left, is very unstable political situation. Repeated numbers of coups, repeated attempts to try to rule the country. The PDPA that killed the Khan and took over the country, they had some very progressive ideas. Now remember, Afghanistan is primarily very ultra-conservative Shia Muslims, all right? But nevertheless, the PDPA had very progressive ideas. They wanted to let women dress in modern attire. They didn't have to wear the burqa. They wanted to let girls go to school. Well, this is totally against the the Shia ideas, where women are supposed to be subjugated and not supposed to be able to do anything on their own, and certainly not go to school. So they wanted to let women go to school. They wanted to grant people religious freedom so that they could practice whatever they wanted. They didn't all have to be Shia Muslims. They also held elections, and they were trying to introduce Western modernization. They wanted to develop infrastructures, and they wanted to modernize the economy as well as the nation. Well, the new government wanted, they're going to need money to do all of these things, and they found that the Europeans were not willing to give them any money, certainly not the British. The British were quite angry at them because they had thrown out the British, so they're not going to get any money from the British. They're not going to get any money from any other European nation. So the only other place that they could turn to was Russia. And so they began to negotiate with Russia, and the Russians were only too happy to send them aid. Now, why are the Russians interested in sending them aid? Because this is the middle of the Cold War. Remember, the Cold War started after the end of the Second World War and continued up until the early 2000s. And so the Cold War then is going on, and this is the whole aspect. The Russians are trying to get control of areas, and of course the United States and the free world are trying to get control. Everybody's afraid of the domino effect. Everybody's afraid that, well, if Afghanistan goes communist, then Iran's going to go communist, then Iraq. In other words, the domino effect. That once you have an infection in one area, it's going to infect everything. So this was all part of the problem. And this is why the Western powers were not willing to fund this new organization that had declared themselves the rulers of Afghanistan. So they get the Russians to help them. All right. This is going to present another real problem. In 1979, now remember, 1979 was a big year. What are all the things that happened in 1979? Well, first of all, 1979 marks the beginning of the Iran-Iraq War. 1979 also marks a time that the Ayatollah Khamenei takes over Iran and seizes the American embassy. All right, 1979 also marks the first incidents in which Russian troops are going to enter Afghanistan. And so 1979 really is a year of tremendous political changes in many areas. So in 1979, then, Afghanistan was facing terrorism. Who are the terrorists? They're primarily the ultra-conservative Shia that did not like the new administration, did not like their attempt to modernize. They didn't want the girls to go to school. They didn't want women to not have to wear the burqa, and all of these wonderful things. So the terrorists then are trying to overthrow the government. So the PDPA then asked for help from Russia. Well, of course, President Carter now has got a real problem. The 1979 marked the seizing of the American embassy. 1979 marks the beginning of the United States sending billions of dollars of military aid to Saddam Hussein so he can fight against the Iranians. And 1979 now faces Carter with the potential of the domino effect with the fall of Afghanistan to the communists, to the Russians. So Carter tells the CIA to go arm the terrorist groups who are trying to overthrow the government in Afghanistan. So basically the United States says, okay, we're going to go aid the terrorists. We're going to aid those people who are trying to overthrow the government. So by 1979 now, we've got a real problem in Afghanistan. We've got the Russians who are trying to keep the administration in power, and we've got the United States helping the organization known as the Mujahideen, who were ultra-conservative Shia, who are basically trying to take over the country. But the United States says at least they are not communists, so it's okay. They're bad guys. They do terrible things, but that's okay because they're not communists. The CIA then begins to send millions and millions of dollars worth of aid to the Mujahideen, and probably the thing that upset the Russians more than anything was that the United States started sending Stinger missiles to them. Now, a Stinger missile is one of these things that you can carry. You can launch it from your shoulder, and you just aim it and fire it. It's a heat-seeking missile, and it's very good at shooting down helicopters and, to some degree, also against jet planes. So with these Stinger missiles, the Russians all of a sudden began losing tremendous numbers of helicopters and airplanes to the Mujahideen now, which is making the situation very difficult for the Russians because you have to have helicopters in order to move troops around. It's too mountainous, it's too terrible. There's no roads in Afghanistan. So without helicopters, you can't really do things too effectively. The CIA then continues sending money to the Mujahideen. They continue sending these Stinger missiles, and they basically help the Mujahideen continue to harass and provide terrorism against the Russians. You can see some of the pictures over here. Here are some of the Mujahideen fighters. Here's one of the Russian helicopters that were knocked down, and here's some more of the Mujahideen fighters. So the CIA then is playing an integral part in trying to overthrow things in Afghanistan. Well, the Afghan government needs more help. So by 1980, they asked Russia to send more troops. They said, you know, the CIA is supplying funds to the Mujahideen. Mujahideen is making significant progress against us, and so we need more troops. So Russia then is requested not only to send more aid, but send more troops. And the Russians then, of course, hoping that they're going to be able to convert them to communism, is happy to send 100,000 more Soviet troops to Afghanistan. Afghanistan is often considered to be the Vietnam of the Russians. Afghanistan was basically a big pit. It was a money pit. It was a person pit. It was a terrible situation for the Russians. During the 10-year war, the Soviet-Afghan War between 1979 and 1989, the Soviets ended up killing an estimated 2 million Mujahideen and Afghanistan civilians as part of the collateral damage from bombings and everything else. By 1989, however, the Soviets have decided that they're going to leave Afghanistan. The cost of staying there was just too much. Much like the United States, who left Vietnam, it finally reached a point where it just wasn't worth staying there. So the Russians there in 1989 decide that in spite of everything, they are giving up and they're going to leave. And so they do. Afghanistan was creating a tremendously high economic cost for the Soviet government. They basically were broke from trying to support their war in Afghanistan. The other thing that was so bad is that the Russians lost more than 14,000 soldiers killed to terrorist activities and warfare in Afghanistan. And of course, there were thousands more who were wounded. Again, the people in Russia were yelling and screaming to bring the troops home, and certainly the problems in Afghanistan were making it very difficult on the economy of Russia. So in 1989 then, after the Russians pull out, the United States and the CIA are happy campers. They're claiming victory. They said, we did it, we did it. We sent the CIA in, we helped the Mujahideen overthrow the government, and they forced the Russians to leave. We don't have to worry about the area becoming communist. So the U.S. loses interest in Afghanistan. The United States says, well, we solved that problem, so let's move on to something else. Well, once the United States left, and once the Russians left, now you've got total chaos going on in Afghanistan. The tribal fighting erupts in 1989 after the Russians leave and after the CIA pulls out. And essentially what you have in Afghanistan are many, many different tribes, and many of the tribes don't particularly like each other. Each of these tribes then could be considered Mujahideen tribes. They were all ultra-conservative, and they were all wanting to control the country. And so many of them are now fighting among themselves in order to control the country. By early 1900s, the elite, the rich, the educated, and most of the intellectuals that were left in Afghanistan have now left. Why? Because of the incessant war, total chaos, and the collapsing economic conditions in Afghanistan. Now, not only were more than 2 million killed during the Afghanistan Soviet war, but now the rest of the, let's just say the cream of the crop has now left. Now, in the midst of all of this fighting among the Mujahideen for control of the country, a new group emerges, and they are called the Taliban. So the Taliban now, a new group, manages to seize control of the capital of Kabul, and in 1996, they finally run the Mujahideen out as well. So the Taliban were better organized, better funded, and they now are in charge of Afghanistan. The Taliban renamed the country the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, and they began a policy of conscription of young boys older than 10. So any young boy from 10 and older were now conscripted into the Taliban military or guerrilla forces, whatever you want to call it. The Taliban is very well funded, and the way they got their money is that they charge a tax on opium and heroin leaving the country. So all of the farmers that are supporting themselves by growing poppies and making heroin and opium now have to pay a tax to the Taliban. The name Taliban actually means student. And the reason that they were called the Taliban is because they considered themselves very ardent students of the Quran. The Taliban called for the most strict and most conservative rules as far as the Quran and Muslims are concerned. They believe in the literal translation of the Taliban. They're ultra-conservative Shia. Many other Muslims in the Middle East, in fact, agree that the Taliban has gone way, way overboard in terms of their religious interpretation. Many other Muslims in the Middle East have argued that what the Taliban has trying to enforce, and the Taliban is still a very big problem in Afghanistan today, that the Taliban basically are misinterpreting much of what they actually read out of the Quran. It's very much like in the United States and other areas, we sometimes have these ultra-conservative Christians who basically believe in the inerrant literacy of the Bible. Now, some of the things that Taliban enforced once they got control of Afghanistan, for example, they said that women could not go to school. Now, remember that the PDPA had tried to encourage women to go to school. Well, the Taliban says no way. So women couldn't go to school. Women were not allowed to talk to any men at all, unless, of course, they were in the presence of one of their relatives. They could not wear makeup. Women must wear the burqa. You can see them up here. You see, they have to be fully covered here, where only just a little slit here where you can see your eyes. Okay? Nobody could clap their hands because even during sporting events, because they believe that this is not something that is said that you could do in the Quran. Basically, they also said that children could not fly kites. There's a wonderful movie that you could probably rent called The Kite Flyers, and it's all about kids in Afghanistan. But anyway, they said you couldn't fly kites. Certainly no men could shave. They couldn't even trim their beards. If you were caught trimming your beard or shaving, you could very often be whipped or put in jail or sometimes even killed. And certainly you couldn't watch television. You couldn't watch videos. Yeah, they also said that nobody could watch magazines or look at magazines. You couldn't listen to radios. You couldn't hang a picture up in your house. You couldn't read. You couldn't do anything. And certainly if women showed any portion of skin, hands, feet, face, or anything, then they could in fact be punished. Now, this brings us to Osama bin Laden. Now, Osama bin Laden, of course, originally had been in Sudan, and he now had moved to Afghanistan where he was training terrorists. And it's from his outpost in Afghanistan that he plotted the attack on the World Trade Centers in 2001. So Afghanistan then is held responsible for allowing Osama bin Laden to be there. So the U.S. military then, after the bombing of the World Trade Centers, you can see here on the left, the United States, President Bush tells the Taliban to turn over Osama bin Laden. Well, the Taliban says, no, we're not going to do that. So again, what happens? Well, President Bush turned to the CIA, turns to covert actions again, sends the CIA and Army Special Forces into Afghanistan, basically to, again, find the Mujahideen, which of course had been now pretty much subjugated by the Taliban. And so now we're going to rearm the Mujahideen. Now remember, we had decided to forget about them in 1989 after the Russians left. Well, now, in 2001, we have to reestablish aid to the Taliban. By 2002, the United States begins missile attacks and drone attacks on the Taliban strongholds throughout Afghanistan, and we continued to do that for quite some time. But the United States also had been sending in ground forces mainly to search for Osama bin Laden. In 2002, the United States gets the local Mujahideen tribes to elect Hamid Karzai as their new president, and the Taliban does not like him at all because Karzai then, of course, is going to be pro-West. He's going to be favorable towards Americans, and he's going to want to try to modernize the country. In 2005, the nation held their first freely elected voting, and in fact, they voted not only for Karzai, but also for the legislature. Now, of course, the United States was behind all of this. They wanted to make sure that Karzai won because he was pro-West. Women were allowed to vote for the first time, and of course, the Taliban retaliated against women, saying that it was a violation of the Quran for women to vote. And so anybody who voted then, as far as the Taliban was concerned, had committed a grievous sin, if you were particularly a woman. In 2007, the Taliban then rise up against the U.S. and the UN and Afghanistan forces. The Taliban continue to carry out terrorism and raids in the country. It's still going on today. So ever since 2002, the Taliban have been a big problem in Afghanistan. Now, the UN and U.S. were continuing to lose troops and resources since 2001 when they first went in there. And between 2001 and 2011, the United States had lost 2,229 dead, more than 20,904 wounded, and another 1,235 UN troops were also killed. So from that 10-year period, from 2001 to 2011, it turned out to be a disaster for the United States. Now, what about Operation Neptune Spear? This is really the essence of Zero Dark 30. The Operation Neptune Spear was carried out by a group of Navy SEALs in 2011. Now, granted, it's not Afghanistan, but what happened was Osama bin Laden left Afghanistan and he goes to Pakistan. Vice Admiral William McRaven, who, by the way, now is Chancellor of the University of Texas in Austin, planned the attack on bin Laden compound. Osama bin Laden was finally found and he was killed in Pakistan in May of 2011. You can see a picture here. This is where he was living here, and you can see the American SEALs here attacking the place. He'd been living in his three-story house in northeastern part of Pakistan for nearly a dozen years. The movie Zero Dark 30 is a good account of what really happened and how bin Laden was finally finally found and killed. So what about today? Today we have 42% of the Americans believe that we never should have been in Afghanistan. They believe the war was a terrible mistake, believe that we shouldn't have ever been there. And they want the United States to totally leave the country. Our President Obama has been trying to get out of Afghanistan ever since he took office 8 years ago. Today, 40% of the Afghanistans believe that the country is headed in the right direction, but they believe that it will eventually get there. It's not there now. And today in Afghanistan, we still have the problem of ISIS. We still have the problem of the Taliban. So it's still a war zone. The biggest problem is that the United States really can't withdraw totally from Afghanistan, or we can't fail to support the Afghan nation. The consequence of the United States leaving and pulling out, much like what happened before when we left the Mujahideen to their own devices, it turned into chaos. So unfortunately, the United States may have to remain here for quite some time. I want to show you this picture right here. This was a picture of a young girl who had her nose cut off because she had tried to go to school. And the the Taliban have enforced very strict things against women. So this has been America's longest war. Following the 2014 presidential election, Karzai then lost to another person, who the new president. The U.S. declared an end to the war in Afghanistan in December of 2014. Thousands of U.S.-led NATO troops and U.S. troops are currently still in the country of Afghanistan, acting as advisors. Between 2001 and 2014, the United States spent more than tens of billions of dollars on developmental aid in the country, trying to help them rebuild their infrastructure. And the United States has spent more than $1 trillion on direct military aid during the same period. So in 2001 to 2014, direct deaths of civilians, the military, there have been over 90,000 people killed and died, and now we've got more than 100,000 additional people that have been injured. So that brings us to a close. That's the end of our look at the Middle East. There's much more we could talk about, but we're out of time. So hopefully things will help and things will eventually straighten out in the Middle East. But unfortunately, I do not believe I will see that in my lifetime. You may not see it in yours. Anyway, I've enjoyed being with you. We will see you in another course. Thank you.